What's up, guys? Welcome to Roaring Podcast, where we interview experts in tech and product management, providing insights and tips on how to digitize and automate your business processes. My name is Jesper Kask, and I'm your host. Today, I'm joined by George Amanatiadis, VP of Sales and Customer Success at Scrive, and Pontus Holmberg, Product and Innovation Manager at Roaring, to discuss and provide insight around this highly relevant topic. Enjoy. Okay, so welcome to the both of you, George and Pontus. It's great having you on the show.
Thanks, nice to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So we're here to talk about customer onboarding experiences and specifically how to tackle the challenge of combining compliance and UX. And I have a very recent experience of a customer onboarding myself, trying to set up a company bank account with one of the larger banks in Sweden. It took literally weeks to complete, and it basically killed all of my digital spirit by being very analog and very manual. And my first question is related to that. So why is this the case in so many industries still? I'll start with you, George.
Yeah, so it's usually the problem with customer or online processes that there are companies that are still trying to balance compliance and customer experience, which usually sort of hurts the how fluent or how easy it is to take steps to onboard yourself. I've had quite a few stories myself. One of the most recent ones is when I picked home insurance from one of the aggregator sites. I ended up choosing a rate that was more expensive, for the reason being that I was asked to print, scan, sign, and return documents, which included two machines that I have never seen for quite some years now, especially not at my apartment. And it's especially important nowadays after the pandemic that people are the expectations have escalated, both due to remote scenarios that were enforced and also generations changing. So customers expect a smoother, easy, lower effort threshold experience from their providers. So it is, I would say, from a behavioral perspective, from a customer expectation perspective, it is more of a competitive advantage than it ever was from a customer experience perspective.
Do you want to fill in, Pontus?
I think George said something well. He in his example, he was using the insurance company, and you also mentioned that your example was from the banking industry. And I think that yes, the easy answer to your question would be, make it very easy, would be to say that B2B companies, in general, I think they're worse in their online onboarding processes in comparison to B2C, because they, I think we will touch on it later. But yes, the note that I made is that, did you change bank? That's the question. Did you change bank because of that sort of poor experience? I don't think you did.
No, I didn't. No.
But if it comes to another kind of product, a simpler B2C product, obviously you're potentially more you're more potentially on your way to actually change provider. Doesn't matter what it is, if it's Netflix or whatever. But so I think that's also part of the answer into it. But they are poorly online experience in some cases when it comes to B2B, because they are also they are big banks or big insurance companies. Obviously they have longer processes to adapt to these new technologies. But in the end, I'm not saying it goes for all banks, but in the end, obviously they're quite happy because they know that you are still going to be a customer to them. It's a hassle to change. So do they need to be best in class? Not yet. But obviously, as George said, it's a competitive advantage to be more also modern in the onboarding process.
I think that gradually this changes. So at least niche services, like if you look at Revolut, if you look at So they're chipping away to what traditional banks used to do. So exchange in the UK has went away. It's okay. It's an app that you do it in. Then transfers went somewhere else. Mortgages will probably move if we have companies like SBB or Danske Bank being a lot more, investments are going to companies like Nordnet or Avanza, stuff like that. So in the grand scheme of things, I think yes, they are. We are in a stage where people, and especially moving generations, where this will be a deciding factor, not as much as it was for me choosing insurance, but even in larger processes, when it comes to mortgages, when it comes to business lending, when it comes to these things, yes, experience will matter in the end, because I think the landscape is changing. Especially if people make it easy for you to transfer. So the recipient is making it easy for you through POAs digitally done, and KYC digitally done to transfer you somewhere else.
Yeah, I actually have a personal experience of that as well recently, because I switched banks from Bank X to Bank Z recently, actually. Yeah. And one of the things that I sort of, moving all of it was a really difficult process in terms of all of the banking services that I had. But one of the things that I sort of changed from was the ISK account, my savings account with the bank, because that was a horrible process just to get everything sold, and it took many days, and I have to sign new agreements with the new bank and so on and so forth. So, but in 2 minutes I could have an account with Fundler, for example, which led me to actually doing that, which was a lot simpler. So I think that's a great example of how sort of the neobanks and the newer financial solution services are sort of chipping away at the full bank offer.
I agree. A comment to George, which I totally agree with you. I can just emphasize that when you are successfully moving away from your bank, it's because, this is my opinion, but I think that, as you said, the onboarding, and it's very simple, but it's selected part of what the bank is actually doing. So for an example, it's simple to sign up for Fundler or Avanza. Basically means that I can move myself away from my bank, where in regards to savings and to pension schemes or whatever, because there is a dozen of services, and so I like you're perfectly correct, because those niche players, they're obviously taking pieces of what the bank is actually doing and then create their own sort of ecosystem, and let's say that we are specialized in robot savings, and then they will be taking customers from the bank in terms of their saving offerings, and then there will be, as you say, mortgage or for borrow money for buying a house. That is also a niche player. So I totally agree with you that that's the way how new sort of companies challenge the banks, because because there is very often, not that very often, a new bank with the full range of an old school bank's activities or merge. They just select one or two or three things, and then they just do it much better than the bank. And as you say, making the transition super simple, because Jesper will have Fundler, but he will potentially not. He might change bank, but you will be a customer with the bank that you have. Your saving accounts or your salary account. You need to have a bank with the core bank functionality, or you don't need. But often people, that's the mentality I think that people have. Or I have changed to Fundler, I have changed to this, but in the end, you will ask a lot of people, and you can ask them, have you sort of ditched your bank, and then because that you have 5-6 other services that sort of gives you that banking experience. And I think that in the end, most likely they will still be a bank customer. That's basically what I meant, that it's a challenge to just move away from your traditional bank. But you're spot on in your analysis that the competition is changing, and new emerging companies are taking or chasing the bank with niche solutions.
And it's a very good example how like technology has been leveraged, like the example that Jesper brought now, like how that you could get set up in 2 minutes. How challenger banks, neobanks, fintech is challenging from an experience, from a process perspective, from an access perspective, larger institutions. And I do understand, of course, I don't want to be I don't want to be unfair. It is easier for a tech company or a smaller company focusing on one thing to do this. However, given the right approach and the right investment, it is very much possible to do it at scale and still compete in all the areas that you do business with.
For sure. Imagine the possibility when someone has a great user experience and has the full bank offering. I mean, that's they'll take over tomorrow.
Yeah, and the bank has the full bank offering, and so if I would be sitting in the bank, I would, what's we're gonna invest in? That we're gonna invest in becoming more modern with more new technology, and then they could obviously sort of fight back against new tech companies or fintech companies.
And what's your take, George, on customer onboarding today and the landscape that we're in? What's wrong with it, and what's broken, and what needs to be fixed, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think that first of all, the approach needs to change. It needs to be a lot more customer centric. So keeping the experience and connecting experience to loyalty and engagement. Either we're talking B2C or B2B. So building a journey for your customer that reflects how the culture is in your organization, how it is to interact with you as a bank or an insurance company or a financial institution in that sense, to show that it should be easy to do business with you, that you respect the customer's time, that you respect the effort threshold, especially with processes that are time sensitive. And then there is, I think it needs to be a clarification in these segments that there is not a battle between compliance and experience. There are, with the help of technology and the right approach to leading projects like this, it is very much possible to build a great customer experience while having the right data points to ensure a compliant and secure onboarding. So I think it's a matter of approach, how we're looking at it, and especially from a B2B perspective, which historically is the segment that has received the least love when it comes to digital transformation. They were the processes that were a bit more complex, a bit more clunky, and they were left to the end of the line. It's like, yeah, we will get to that at some point, and that point for many organizations hasn't arrived just yet.
You want to chime in, Pontus?
No, I will, but I think George is also onto something. One note that I do is that, take the bank example again, sort of the old-fashioned bank. Customer experience in that segment, so for an example, they've been quite good in changing the user experience when it comes to sort of design and UI in their banking platform. But I think that if I understood George correct, I think that they need in general now also to take the same sort of approach when it comes to, we are talking about user experience, or they need to have the same approach when it comes to user experience sort of in the customer onboarding process. I think normally, or before at least, it has been separated. So you have your user experience when it comes to the actual experience of the service or the product, and then you have sort of separated the whole sort of customer onboarding experience. A good example of this is, again, I will mention the B2C versus B2B. They've spent a lot of B2C companies are spending a lot of money in they have understood that how they actually are interacting with their customers. You need to have a flawless experience in your app or on your web page. So they put a lot of efforts in design and making, the user experience from a product perspective really good. But also, obviously, they understood the mechanism, how that actually relates to the customer onboarding process. So there is no separation between that. And I think that old-fashioned big companies are struggling with, they know that they need to change that, but they're still, they are slaves under their own processes. So when you're talking about compliance and regulatory work, that's, for some people, you start to snooze out immediately. But the thing is that I think you need to see those compliance requirements, you need to see them as business enabler. So because the ones that will be able to conquer that hurdle and to be able to get the customer to actually do things automatically, because the bank has understood that they can now provide some part of their advanced compliance processes. But if you start out small, instead of asking for known information, which could easily be fetched by an API, start off small, then you will actually hook, you will actually get a better experience from the sort of the customer perspective. Today, fairly good in my bank. It looks well. I actually found what I want to do on within the bank, but it's a horrible process. For an example, in my KYC process, they haven't merged those two things because they see it as a regulatory thing that needs to be checked off, and there's a lot of process behind that. So still, they provide me with a form that I can fill in, and the form for me, it's just a digital paper. So it hasn't reduced any of the complexity that I need to find out information in my drawer. And I know that the bank already sits on the information. So yeah, it was a long comment on George take, but I just think that they need to marry those two things. User experience goes all the way, not only in the product or in the service that you're providing.
And we're getting into compliance now, and obviously a lot of companies are affected by this being subject to the Money Laundering Act. We're talking KYC and other processes, or GDPR, for example. How much of a roadblock does compliance requirements create in customer onboarding, or is it, like you said, Pontus, is it a business enabler? What do you think?
I know I'm, what's the word, swearing a little bit in church here, and obviously I'm not a legal expert, but I'm coming from the business side, working with those things. I would say that for me, the Money Laundering Act or the GDPR implementation, it's business enabler, but it's a hurdle for the organizations initially, because it requires change in their processes, and it requires obviously investment for them to mitigate the initial hurdle that it actually creates. But for me today, when we are talking about GDPR, today I don't hear the debate that it's a pain or a headache. I just hear that we need to take that into account when we are developing our products, when we are developing our products, services. But 4 years ago, the discussion was about, this is just gonna ruin our business. If we cannot do this with our customer data, how would we operate as a business? How would we survive? I obviously don't have any numbers on it, but the companies are still there. If they've fallen, they haven't been go bust because of GDPR. There's other reasons for it. So I with that said, I think that yes, the compliance framework becomes more complicated, more requirements it's put on the companies. But I think that the companies that understand those mechanisms and actually try to do something and see it as a business enabler, because I would pick any product or whatever if the onboarding process then has taken into those changes. I'm more likely to sign up for that service today. So I think it goes hand in hand. So for me, it's a business enabler, but it's complicated and it's tough. And obviously for big banks or insurance companies, I think that they think it also is complicated because it also requires a lot of investment in getting compliant with the new regulatory frameworks that is in place.
What's your take on this, George?
I tend to agree. I think it can be a hurdle, but as I said before, it has to do with the approach that the project is taking. So it can be a hurdle if you want to see it as a hurdle. So otherwise, it is a framework in which you operate in, such as it is GDPR, so is IDAS, so is Schrems 2. So it's a lot of directives, EBA rules. You have a quite broad rule set that you need to operate within. However, especially, for instance, we're talking banking, it's an industry that is quite familiar with operating under restrictions. So I think it's an approach when it comes to having compliance-led projects instead of designing something and then advising compliance in the later stages, or trying to fit the big picture into a compliant funnel. And also, this is where technology sort of comes in, both as the tech itself, but also the organizations behind it, being able to understand the complexity in depth, because something that is complex doesn't necessarily need to be complicated as a project. If you address the pain points or the requirements quite early on and find the right fit for each segment of your project, given that you operate within the confines of what is required to construct a customer flow or an experience that is pleasant and easy to do while being compliant, I think we can find a lot of success, given that we address these concepts with compliance in mind, with very good results in the end. So it doesn't need to be a hurdle. I think it's more a matter of approach and more of a matter of how we frame projects, because both the technology and the experience in these industries, both from the tech companies and from the financial industry, is there to combine the two. So to summarize, no, I don't believe it's a hurdle. It's rather it can be an enabler, and it can boost the feeling of security for the customers as well, especially in B2B, seeing that you're thorough, seeing that you're taking all the steps to secure that their information are safe. If we're talking GDPR, for instance, that you do thorough checks, that everything is streamlined and secure. So it can enhance customer experience, given that it is easy enough to navigate.
Okay, so let's get practical now. In terms of ensuring that you are legally compliant while maintaining an awesome experience for the prospect or customer, how do you go about doing that? And let's just to set the scene, the context is a banking or finance customer onboarding. Pontus, do you want to go first?
Yeah, we touched on it already, but I would say that it's a mindset, as George already said before, but it's a mindset, and also truly digital adaptation here is the word or the sentence for me, because they are struggling, and they obviously, if it's an old classic bank, they're struggling with legacy in terms of technology legacy, etc., which potentially can be an obstacle for them in this sort of digital adaptation. But I think that you can obviously ensure being compliant. Then the bank obviously have their processes, they have their legal understanding of how to conduct their business. But then you said from the other side, how do you then maintain a good customer experience? So I think initially, for me, it would be keep your processes or your understanding of what you need to do, but also start using technology to implement new technology to support that, if we call it automation. But it's easy for me to say, because obviously we are working with automation. That's what we're doing. That's what we want. Everyone, use our data, use our technology, whatever. But I'm not saying that, an API or just by using modern technologies that you would automatically just be automating your processes. There is obviously a combination of automation and manual processes. But first step, at least from my perspective, would be automate the simple things that today are done manually. We have tons of examples where we actually know that, there are 5 people just working to identify or to check information X and Y and Z. But the information, what they are basically doing is that they are going surfing, or they are using other platforms to ensure that information is correct. So with that long answer, keep your manual processes when they are needed. But obviously, when you can automate things and when you can actually use third-party technologies, third-party information sources, start doing that and reduce complexity where you don't need to have complex processes within the compliance framework, which is potentially complex but not complicated, as George laid it out. I think start off somewhere to use technology, use data, and start automate where it makes sense to automate. And automation as a word do not solve the compliance burden. They need to have their compliance in place and their processes in place. But you can rip some of the processes and link to technology that would actually support the process, make them smoother. That's a long answer again.
Yeah, what's your take, George? How do you combine compliance and UX to great effect in customer onboarding?
So I think, as we kind of touched on it before, but I think it's a matter of project approach. So we have, once we have consulted the compliance side of things, when we make sure that we know what confines are we operating within, then is in our experience, it's a matter of like sort of reimagining or restructuring how the customer experience should look like. We're looking at more and more organizations focusing on customer effort scores, how hard or how easy it is, how much effort is required for a customer to complete an action. Either that is onboarding, changing data, taking up additional products. And usually that line doesn't follow. Like maybe we fix onboarding, but like adding a second signatory to an account is harder, or taking a loan with 2 parties goes from digital to manual. So trying to reapproach this from a customer-centric angle, trying to redesign, not to necessarily transfer what's on paper digitally, because that is a topic that I've seen quite a lot. Trying to copy the exact pen and paper process to a digital onboarding. And there are hurdles there that we had to have in the physical environment that we don't need to consider, or we don't need to have in a digital onboarding scenario. But I think the best approach, the best projects that I've seen is when we approach this concept with a customer-centric angle and with an open mind, going to trusted partners, the technology vendors, and looking at what is possible to do in order to achieve the end goal, instead of having pre-constructed functionality. Looking at possibilities. There is a lot of technology out there, and there are quite a few, or there are some experienced partners out there that can help, both from a project approach and from the technology side. And then it also has to do with how do you approach the full flow from using technology as an enabler, as means to an end, instead of looking at digital transformation so as sort of a buzzword. It is quite common in our industry to see technology as the end all be all, and there is a lot of substance to that, because technology can solve a lot of problems as long as we frame them in the right in the correct way, I would say.
And you touched upon digital transformation, and when we're talking customer onboarding and possibly changing the process from analog or manual to automated and digital, we're also talking about mindsets, and we're talking about culture. what's required in order to successfully digitally transform not only the process itself, but a company as a whole? What do you think, George?
Yeah, so I think it has to do with allocating. It has to do with how you construct an effort like that. It usually is organization-wide. It involves several departments. It needs to be an initiative that does a quite deep needs analysis, both within the organization and on the customer base, understanding what hurdles might we face, from compliance to legal to customer experience, to staffing, to resources required, having a very clear picture. Then having a vision of where we want to be as an endpoint, like what are we looking to achieve, having very clear targets. So if we say that we want to reduce the effort threshold, if we want to reduce the clicks, the onboarding time, if we want to improve our NPS score, if we want to relate how good our onboarding is to how engaged our customers are, because we have seen very clear links between the two as well. And then once we have a clear requirement set to look for expertise, both internally and from external resources, so companies that have a track record in the industry, that understand the challenges in detail, and especially looking for input that doesn't look to bypass or disregard restrictions, but rather use them, as Pontus very well mentioned, as more as an enabler or as a springboard to create business process. And then again, once more, trying to transfer customer centricity as a culture from within the organization to every step. Again, referring to what you said before, every step, every touch point that the customer has with us, either it is B2B, B2C, onboarding, changing in services, or any interaction that it should follow the same logic and the same feeling that we exude as an organization.
And I'll give you this one as well, Pontus.
Yeah,
what is required to successfully in order to successfully digitally transform?
I'll try to be short, but I think George said it well. I think cross departments is sort of a key word that or sentence that comes up to me. I think that you need to understand that compliance and regulatory requirements from the society doesn't necessarily need to be. Yeah, they are heavily to work with potentially, but you need to see them as some kind of enabler for your business, and also by not only letting it becomes a legal matters or very advanced legal matters, try to incorporate also other divisions into this, because if sales would understand slightly more about why there is challenges with being compliant and why do we need to ask all those questions to our customer, for an example, and then if you put in if you are a big company, you potentially have a design division or a UX division, put them also into this sort of project when you're working with compliance and regulatory frameworks, policies, etc. Not necessarily the boring part. The legal people can still sort of manage. They are the ones that needs to confirm and to create a process that are compliant. But just a final example for me would be, again, the bank example. Yes, you have designers that have developed a new bank platform and it looks good. And then they throw up at me, know your customer survey, every once a year. There is no design people involved in that. Obviously, there is a policy, obviously. We need to ask those questions. But the way that has been created for me as a user, it is just horrible. In general, it looks horrible. It's hard to follow. The language is hard to follow. and they are asking again informations that I might not have at hand. So I think that that's just an example, but I think that also let design be a part of this journey or user experience, because that will create user experience. So develop your great bank experience platform, but do not forget about put some love into, the customer interactions that you have sort of outside that ecosystem. And because that will eventually, a customer often will judge a company or a service not only because if the service is superior to another, it's about the way it interacts with the service or the product or the company. So I can definitely go with a slightly more uglier interface in a product, but I can definitely rate that product higher if, for an example, the KYC process for me as a customer is smooth and looks a little bit more better than traditional banks are doing. So I think there is forgetting about how it sort of works. Everything works together. That's the thing. Don't see compliance and regulatory challenges as an interest of a few at a company. It's not a special interest. There are specialized people working with it, but it's obviously affect the whole business. So obviously it needs to be a part of your business. It needs to be a part of business.
And in terms of leaving the listeners with something to bring with them, any closing thoughts, George, on combining UX and compliance in customer onboarding?
Any closing thoughts? Yeah, so it's from I would say what I would take away from this when it comes to, I want to close in a circle what we started discussing about before when it comes to experience, is that we have talked a lot, and the industry talks a lot about how customer expectations have changed, and they have, both from like event-driven changes and also from the generation changes. However, there is an element that has to do with there is a constant that does not change since the beginning of customer relationships, and that is that our customers want to feel taken care of, and that we put real thought and care into building a process that takes care of them, that thinks of them, that looks at their needs and how they approach, how they want to buy, or how they want to interact with us. So having that approach in everything that we do, from transferring compliance, as Pontus said, into process, to building steps, to having even very complex KYC processes. I've seen excellent flows where there is the ability to fetch data that we know are available, that we don't need to ask the customer to redo, to having a very short text explaining what each step is and why it's there and why it's important. So again, customer centricity for me it should be the guiding principle, and then remembering that it's compliance and customer experience, they absolutely do not need to clash. They can, given the right angle, they can be combined with very, very good results, both for the organization in itself and for their customers.
Pontus?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with George, and definitely I agree on everything, but I'll agree even more on the combination of that. Being compliant doesn't necessarily, it's not a clash with having a great sort of customer or user experience. And I will not repeat myself, but I think that the key takeaway from me would be that, again, do not separate it, and just absorb compliance and regulatory frameworks as a part of your business. That's and when you do that, again, use all your resources in a company. There is design elements that can definitely enhance the customer experience when it comes to being compliant or when you're in your KYC process. And finally, I would just say that, and this might potentially goes a little bit more towards B2B companies, but don't be afraid also to look at, why do B2C companies and potentially younger B2C companies with less legacy, they are successful in this sort of transition. They have understand the mechanism on how to create value with your product, but also because I think, as George said, the customer wants to be seen and they want to interact with you in a clever and in a modern way. And I think that finally will be, if you are not merging the user experience and the compliance framework processes, that will be a challenge for because the customer again will ultimately judge you. So if you get a great experience over here but a really poor experience over here, that will obviously ultimate result in that NPS score potentially would be obviously lower. So it's a combination of both things, and design obviously do not solve everything, and processes and technology do not solve anything, but in the middle you can definitely create a smooth onboarding process, a great user experience in your service. But I think the challenge here for the big companies, because I think that the challenge lies within the big companies in general, they need to they need to rip apart those silos that are in an organization. Yeah, you're working with compliance. They obviously do not that often talk to the salespeople, and salespeople do think that their compliance department is just there to make obstacles in their sales process, etc. And the tech team, yes, things. So it's just a mash of everything. So trying to create processes in your company that actually have the same goal and yes, absorb compliance and regulatory frameworks and the challenges with that into your daily processes and into your daily strategy. Do not look at it as a single entity that is working up here with very boring things, because it's not. Yeah, for me it's boring, but it's really interesting because what happens when you can create that magic, when you actually succeed with having a great customer experience and an onboarding process, businesses will go like this. That would be the goal for any company.
Great. Listen, thank you both for joining me. It was great having you on. You've been listening to an episode of a Roaring podcast by Roaring.io. Feel free to share it with your friend, colleague, or peer if you liked it. If you wish to stay connected to us, don't forget to subscribe to the show. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.